At my sister's anniversary celebration, I was treated like a stranger who crashed the party, but when her husband's lawyer pulled me aside for a private conversation, the tables turned in ways nobody saw coming. My name is Zara Hendricks, and what started as the most humiliating evening of my life became the night I discovered the truth that would change everything. They thought they could push me to the margins, make me invisible in my own family, but they had no idea what I was about to uncover. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with gold foil edges, the kind that whispers expensive before you even read the words. Mr. and Mrs. Marcus Coleman request the pleasure of your company as we celebrate 10 years of marriage. The Riverside Country Club, cocktails at 6, dinner to follow. At the bottom, in Ivy's flowing handwriting, a note that made my stomach drop. Zara, please keep things low-key. This is really important to us. I stared at those words for a long time, sitting in my cramped Pearl District apartment while rain drummed against the windows. Low-key. What exactly did that mean? I'd been Ivy's sister for 28 years, and I'd never needed instructions on how to behave at family events. But then again, things had been different lately. Ever since Marcus got promoted to senior partner at his firm, and Ivy started that interior design business, there had been a distance between us that felt intentional. I chose a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. I even left my favorite vintage jewelry at home, the pieces our grandmother had given me before she passed. Looking back, I should have worn every single sparkling thing I owned. I should have walked in there like I belonged, because the truth was I did belong. More than anyone realized. The Riverside Country Club sat perched above the Willamette River, like a monument to old Portland money. I'd been here countless times growing up for charity galas and business dinners when Dad's real estate development company was thriving. Back then, I was always included, always part of the family presentation. Tonight felt different from the moment I stepped out of my rideshare. The valet gave me a polite but puzzled look, the kind reserved for people who might be lost. When I mentioned the Coleman anniversary party, his expression shifted to something closer to pity. He directed me toward a side entrance, not the grand front doors where other guests were streaming in. That should have been my first warning. Inside, the ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and white roses arranged in tall glass vases. Everything looked perfect, like a magazine spread come to life. I recognized the style immediately as Ivy's work. All clean lines and subtle luxury. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner while servers in crisp white shirts circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvre. I spotted my parents near the bar, Dad in his best navy suit, and Mom wearing a pearl gray dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. They were deep in conversation with the mayor and his wife, all smiles and animated gestures. I approached slowly, hoping for a warm greeting, maybe even a compliment on how nice I looked. Mom noticed me first. Her smile faltered for just a moment before returning. But it was different now, tighter around the edges. "Zara, you made it," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she was trying to sound pleased but wasn't quite managing it. "You look nice," she added, but her eyes were already scanning the room, looking for someone more important to talk to. Dad nodded in my direction without really looking at me. The mayor's wife, who had known me since I was 12, gave me a confused glance before turning back to whatever story Dad was telling. I stood there for a moment, waiting for an invitation into the conversation, but it never came. The invisible wall was so thick, I could practically touch it. I excused myself and went looking for Ivy. She was holding court near the windows that overlooked the river, surrounded by her design clients and Marcus's law firm colleagues. She looked stunning in a champagne-colored dress that caught the light every time she moved. Her laugh carried across the room, bright and musical, the sound of someone who had everything she'd ever wanted. When she saw me approaching, her expression went through several rapid changes: surprise, concern, and something that looked suspiciously like annoyance. She broke away from her group and met me halfway, her hands reaching for mine in a gesture that looked affectionate from a distance but felt desperate up close. "Thank you for coming," she said, squeezing my fingers. Her smile was perfect, but her eyes were worried. You remember what I said about keeping things low-key, right? There are some really important people here tonight, and Marcus is trying to make a good impression. I nodded, confused but willing to play along. Of course, I whispered back. I'm just here to celebrate with you both. That's what sisters do. Something flickered across her face then, an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Guilt, maybe, or regret. But before I could ask what was wrong, Marcus appeared at her side, his arms sliding possessively around her waist. Marcus had always been handsome, in that clean-cut, all-American way that looked good in family photos and law firm brochures. Tonight he seemed to radiate success, from his perfectly tailored tuxedo to the confident way he commanded attention. But when he looked at me, there was something cold in his expression that hadn't been there at their wedding 10 years ago. Zara, he said, his voice polite but distant. Glad you could make it. His handshake was brief, dismissive. I hope you'll understand that tonight is really about our professional network. We're trying to keep the focus on business relationships. I felt heat rise in my cheeks but kept my voice steady. I'm family, Marcus. I just want to celebrate this milestone with you both. Of course, he said quickly, but his smile never reached his eyes. It's just that some of these connections are really crucial for Ivy's business and my partnership track. You understand? I didn't understand, not really, but I nodded anyway. I was starting to feel like I was speaking a language everyone else had forgotten, like I was operating with a different set of rules that nobody had bothered to explain to me. The dinner seating chart was displayed on an elegant easel near the entrance to the dining room. I found my name at table 12, in the back corner, sandwiched between Marcus's elderly great-aunt who was hard of hearing and a +1 whose date had apparently cancelled. Every other table was filled with Portland's social elite, business leaders, and young professionals on the rise. Table 12 felt like exile. During dinner, I watched Ivy and Marcus work the room from the head table, which was positioned like a stage at the front of the ballroom. They moved through their speeches with practiced ease, thanking their guests for sharing this special evening, talking about their journey together, their dreams for the future. Ivy spoke about her growing design business and the exciting projects on the horizon. Marcus discussed his recent promotion and his commitment to serving the community through his legal work. Not once did either of them mention family. Not our parents, not our shared childhood, not the years of memories that had brought us to this moment. It was as if their life together had sprung fully formed into existence 10 years ago, with no history, no roots, no messy complications like sisters who didn't quite fit the image they were trying to project. I applauded when everyone else did, smiled when the photographer pointed his camera in my direction, and made polite conversation with my table mates. But inside, something was shifting, a slow-burning realization that this wasn't just about keeping things professional. This was about erasing me from their narrative entirely. After dinner, as the dancing began and the evening wound into its more relaxed phase, I found myself standing alone on the terrace, looking out over the dark river. The October air was crisp and clean, a relief after the stuffy formality of the ballroom. I was considering calling for a ride home when I heard footsteps behind me. "Miss Hendricks?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, with just a hint of urgency. I turned to find a woman in her 50s approaching, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She wore a black suit that screamed expensive attorney, and her expression was serious. "I'm Patricia Grayson," she said, extending her hand. "I'm with Blackwood, Nash & Associates." "I've been looking for you all evening." I shook her hand, confused. "I'm sorry, do we know each other? Are you with Marcus's firm?" She shook her head, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "No, I represent someone else entirely, someone who has been trying to reach you for quite some time." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. "This concerns the estate of Eleanor Whitmore." The name hit me like a physical blow. Eleanor Whitmore had been my grandmother's best friend, a woman who had been like a second grandmother to me throughout my childhood. She had passed away 6 months ago, and I'd been devastated that I missed the funeral. Ivy had told me she'd only found out about it after the fact, that Eleanor's family had kept the service very small and private.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Mrs. Whitmore left specific instructions, Patricia continued, her voice gentle but firm. She wanted you to have something, but there have been complications with the family regarding her will. Complications that, frankly, involve people very close to you. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. What kind of complications? Patricia glanced toward the ballroom, where I could see Ivy and Marcus still mingling with their guests through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The kind that involve property transfers, forged signatures, and deliberate interference with the execution of a deceased person's wishes. Mrs. Whitmore was very specific about her intentions regarding you, Miss Hendricks, but someone has been working very hard to make sure you never found out about them. My hands were shaking as I took the envelope. Inside were photocopies of documents, legal papers with official seals and notarized signatures. But even in the dim terrace lighting, I could see that something was wrong. The papers referenced a property I'd never heard of, a vineyard in the Willamette Valley that Eleanor had apparently left to me. But the signature accepting the transfer on my behalf wasn't mine. It was close enough to fool someone who didn't know my handwriting intimately. But the Z in Zara was wrong, too angular, and my last name was signed with a flourish I'd never used in my life. Someone had forged my signature to accept a property transfer, and then apparently done something else with the property entirely. I know this is a shock, Patricia said quietly. Mrs. Whitmore anticipated there might be resistance from certain family members. She left very detailed instructions about what to do if this exact situation arose. She said you might not even know about the inheritance, that certain people might try to keep it from you. Who? I whispered, though I was starting to have a terrible suspicion. Patricia pulled out another document, this one showing the current ownership status of the vineyard. According to these records, the property had been transferred to me 6 months ago, then immediately transferred again to a company called Evergreen Holdings, LLC. The authorized signature on the second transfer was also mine, also forged, but this time the forgery was even sloppier. Evergreen Holdings, it turned out, was owned by Marcus and Ivy Coleman. They stole it, I breathed, the words barely audible over the sound of music drifting from the ballroom. They forged my signature and stole my inheritance. Patricia nodded grimly. Mrs. Whitmore suspected something like this might happen. She was very worried about your family dynamics in her final months. She left specific instructions that if any irregularities occurred with the transfer, I was to find you personally and make sure you understood your rights. I looked down at the papers in my hands, trying to process what I was seeing. Eleanor Whitmore had left me a vineyard worth potentially millions of dollars, and my own sister and brother-in-law had stolen it by forging my signature. They had attended Eleanor's funeral, had probably expressed their condolences to her family, all while planning to defraud me. There's more, Patricia said softly. Mrs. Whitmore also left you a personal letter. She said to give it to you only after you understood the legal situation. The letter was handwritten on Eleanor's familiar cream-colored stationery, her spidery handwriting instantly recognizable. My dearest Zara, it began. If you are reading this, then my worst fears about your family have proven true. I have watched with growing concern as certain members of your family have worked to diminish your place in their lives, and I cannot stand by and let them diminish your inheritance as well. The vineyard belonged to my late husband's family for 3 generations. It has no sentimental value to anyone but you, because you are the only one who truly understood what it meant to me. Do you remember those summer afternoons when you were 12 and 13, when you would help me tend the roses along the fence line? You were the only one who listened when I talked about the history of the land, the stories of the families who had worked it before us. Your sister never cared about such things. Even as a child, she was more interested in what things cost than what they meant. I fear she has grown into someone who sees everything, including family relationships, as transactions to be managed for maximum benefit. I pray I am wrong, but I suspect I am not. The vineyard is yours, not because I loved you more, but because you are the only one who will love it for what it truly is. Please don't let anyone convince you that you don't deserve this gift. You deserve so much more than the scraps they've been offering you. I had to sit down on one of the terrace chairs, the letter trembling in my hands. Eleanor had seen what I was only beginning to understand about my own family. She had watched them systematically exclude me, and had tried to provide some security for my future, knowing they would try to take even that away. Patricia sat down across from me, her expression compassionate but professional. Mrs. Whitmore also left funds for legal representation. She wanted to make sure you had the resources to fight for what's rightfully yours, regardless of who might oppose you. Inside the ballroom, I could see Ivy laughing at something one of her clients had said, her hand resting on Marcus's arm. They looked so perfect together, so successful and happy. The golden couple celebrating their golden life, built on a foundation of lies and theft. "What do I do now?" I asked Patricia. "Now," she said, folding the documents back into her briefcase, "you decide whether you want to fight for what's yours, or let them get away with it. But I should warn you, once we begin legal proceedings, there's no going back. This will become public knowledge. Your family will know that you know." I thought about walking back into that ballroom, about smiling and pretending everything was fine, about going home to my small apartment and my small life while they enjoyed the fruits of their deception. I thought about all the times I'd been made to feel like I was asking for too much, expecting too much, wanting more than I deserved. Then I thought about Eleanor, about the woman who had seen my worth when my own family couldn't, who had tried to secure my future even from beyond the grave. "I want to fight," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I want them to face consequences for what they've done." Patricia smiled for the first time that evening. "Mrs. Whitmore said you would say that. She said you had more steel in your spine than anyone gave you credit for. We'll start with a forensic analysis of the signatures and an audit of all transactions related to the property. Once we have our evidence in order, we'll file both civil and criminal complaints." She handed me her business card and a copy of Eleanor's letter. "Keep this somewhere safe. And Miss Hendricks? Don't let them know you know. Not yet. Let them think they've gotten away with it a little while longer. It will make our case that much stronger when the time comes." I walked back into the ballroom, with Eleanor's letter tucked safely in my purse and a newfound clarity about my place in this family. The party was winding down, guests beginning to make their polite departures. I found Ivy near the gift table, organizing cards and envelopes with the efficiency that had made her business so successful. She looked up when I approached, her smile automatic but tired. "Zara, I was wondering where you'd gone. Did you have a good time?" I studied her face, looking for any sign of guilt or awareness of what she'd done. But Ivy had always been good at compartmentalizing, at separating the different parts of her life into neat, manageable categories. Tonight she was in hostess mode, gracious and grateful, playing her role perfectly. "It was lovely," I said, matching her tone. "Everything was absolutely perfect. You and Marcus have built such a beautiful life together." "Thank you," she said, her relief evident. "That means so much coming from you. I know tonight was a little formal, but it's important for Marcus's career that we maintain certain appearances." I nodded understandingly. "Of course, image is everything in your line of work. People have to trust that you'll protect their interests, that you'll never do anything to betray that trust." Something flickered in her expression, too quick to interpret. "Exactly. We've worked so hard to build our reputation, we can't afford any complications." I hugged her goodbye, the same sisterly embrace we'd shared 1,000 times before, but this time I was memorizing it, knowing it might be the last innocent moment between us. When I stepped back, she was smiling that perfect smile again, already turning her attention to the next guest who needed to be thanked and dismissed. Marcus was by the door, shaking hands and accepting congratulations. When he saw me approaching, he stepped forward with his politician's smile. "Zara, thank you for coming. I know Ivy appreciated having you here." His handshake was firm, confident, the grip of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. "Congratulations on 10 wonderful years," I said. "Here's to many more years of happiness and success. May you get exactly what you deserve." He laughed, missing the edge in my voice entirely. "From your lips to God's ears. We've been incredibly blessed." As I waited for my rideshare outside the country club, I could see the warm glow from the ballroom windows, could hear the faint sound of music and laughter. It looked like a perfect ending to a perfect evening, the kind of celebration that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. But I knew something they didn't know yet. I knew that their perfect life was built on a crime, and that the evidence was already in the hands of someone who wouldn't be intimidated by their success or their connections. Eleanor Whitmore had reached out from beyond the grave to make sure justice would be served, and I wasn't going to let her down. The rain had started again by the time my ride arrived, a gentle Pacific Northwest drizzle that made everything shine under the streetlights. As we drove away from the Riverside Country Club, I pulled out Patricia Grayson's business card and Eleanor's letter. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight had been their celebration. But the next chapter of this story would be mine to write. The morning after the anniversary party arrived, gray and drizzling. Portland's signature weather that seemed to match my mood perfectly. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee growing cold between my hands, staring at Patricia Grayson's business card propped against the sugar bowl. The events of the previous evening felt surreal, like a dream that had taken a sharp turn into nightmare territory. I kept replaying the moment when Patricia had shown me those forged documents, the casual way my sister and Marcus had stolen my inheritance while planning their perfect anniversary celebration. The audacity of it was breathtaking. They had literally been toasting their decade of marriage with champagne bought with money that should have been mine. My phone buzzed with a text from Ivy. "Thank you again for coming last night. It meant so much to have family there." The message was followed by a heart emoji, the kind of casual affection that would have warmed me yesterday but now felt like salt in an open wound. I started typing several responses, then deleted them all. Patricia had been clear about not letting them know I was aware of their deception. For now, I needed to play the role of the obedient little sister, who was grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. Instead of responding immediately, I decided to visit Uncle Thomas. He lived in a craftsman bungalow in the Alberta district, surrounded by the kind of overgrown garden that suggested someone who had more important things to worry about than perfectly manicured landscaping. Dad's younger brother had always been the family truth-teller, the one who saw through pretenses and called things by their real names. Thomas answered the door in paint-splattered overalls, his gray beard flecked with what looked like yellow acrylic. He was an artist, the kind of struggling creative that Mom and Dad had always regarded with a mixture of affection and pity. But he was also the only family member who had never made me feel like I needed to apologize for existing. "Zara," he said, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. "What brings you to my humble chaos this fine morning?" Come in. Just finished a piece I think you'll appreciate." His living room doubled as a studio, canvases leaning against every available wall surface. The latest painting showed a forest scene, but the trees were twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches reaching toward a sky that seemed to be actively pulling away from them. It was beautiful and disturbing at the same time. "That's stunning," I said, and meant it. "There's something desperate about it, but hopeful too." Thomas wiped his hands on a rag and studied the painting critically. "It's about disconnection, the way families can grow apart even when they're standing in the same room. Been working on the concept for months now." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. Thomas had always been perceptive, but this felt eerily relevant to my current situation. "Did you go to Ivy's anniversary party last night?" He shook his head, settling into an armchair that had seen better decades. "Wasn't invited." "Your sister sent me a lovely card, explaining that they were keeping it small and intimate, just their closest professional contacts and immediate family." Apparently, I don't qualify as immediate enough. The casual way he delivered this information made it somehow worse than if he'd sounded hurt or angry. Thomas had been there for every major family milestone I could remember. He'd taught both Ivy and me to ride bikes, had been the one to pick us up from school when our parents were too busy with work. The idea that he hadn't been welcome at his own niece's anniversary celebration was unconscionable. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I had no idea you weren't invited." He waved off my apology. "Not your fault, kiddo. Besides, I'm getting used to being persona non grata in certain family circles. Ever since I refused to sell my house to your dad's development company, I've been somewhat less popular at holiday gatherings." This was news to me. "Dad wanted to buy your house?" Thomas laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Wanted is a strong word. More like pressured, cajoled, and eventually tried to strong-arm me into selling. This whole neighborhood is being gentrified, and apparently my little slice of artistic squalor was bringing down property values for the luxury condos they want to build. I thought about the pristine country club from the night before, the careful curation of success and status. It seemed my family had a pattern of deciding who belonged and who didn't, then taking action to enforce those decisions. Thomas must have seen something in my expression because his tone grew more serious. "Everything okay, Zara? You look like someone who's just discovered something unpleasant about the world." I found myself telling him everything. About the anniversary party, about Patricia Grayson and the forged documents, about Eleanor Whitmore's vineyard, and the inheritance that had been stolen from me. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at his painting of disconnected trees. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said finally. "I remember her. She used to come to your grandmother's bridge parties when you were little. Sharp as a tack, that one. Always said she could see right through people's pretenses. You knew her." "Not well, but we talked a few times at family gatherings. She was worried about you, even back then. Said she could see how your parents favored Ivy, how they were training you to accept less than you deserved. She used to call it emotional conditioning." The phrase hit me like a physical blow, emotional conditioning. As if I'd been systematically taught to expect disappointment, to be grateful for whatever minimal attention my family was willing to provide. Thomas stood up and walked to a bookshelf crammed with art books and philosophy texts. He pulled out a manila folder and handed it to me. "I've been keeping track of your dad's business dealings for my own protection. Neighborhood watch, you might say. You might find some of this interesting." Inside the folder were newspaper clippings, property records, and photocopied documents related to Hendricks and Associates. The picture that emerged was of a company that operated right at the edge of ethical business practices, using connections and influence to secure deals that might not survive closer scrutiny. One document in particular caught my attention. It was a property transfer for a parcel of land adjacent to Uncle Thomas's house, dated just 3 months ago. The previous owner was listed as Evergreen Holdings, LLC. "That's Marcus and Ivy's company," I said, my heart racing. Thomas nodded grimly. "They bought that lot 6 months ago, right around the time your Eleanor Whitmore died. Been wondering where they got the capital for such an expensive investment. Guess now we know." The realization that my stolen inheritance was being used to pressure my uncle out of his home added another layer of violation to an already sickening situation. They weren't just thieves, they were using my own money to hurt the one family member who had always been kind to me. "I need to call Patricia Grayson," I said, pulling out my phone. "This is evidence of how they're using the stolen property." Thomas put a gentle hand on my arm. "Before you do that, there's something else you should know. I've been doing some digging of my own, and I think there might be more properties involved. Eleanor Whitmore wasn't the only elderly woman in our social circle who died recently with questionable changes to her estate planning." He showed me another folder, this one containing obituaries and property records for 3 other women who had been friends of our grandmother. Each had died within the past year, and each had made last-minute changes to their wills that benefited various members of the extended Hendricks family network. Margaret Chen left her downtown loft to a cousin, who immediately sold it to a development company. Ruth Morrison's antique collection went to a distant nephew who liquidated everything through a high-end auction house. Dorothy Palmer's beach cottage was inherited by a great-niece who flipped it within weeks of the funeral. The pattern was unmistakable, and it made me feel sick to my stomach. This wasn't just about my inheritance. It was part of a larger scheme targeting vulnerable elderly women who had trusted our family. "I think," Thomas said quietly, "that your sister and her husband might be running a very sophisticated con game, and I think your parents might be involved too." As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang. Mom's name appeared on the screen, along with a photo from last Christmas where she was wearing the kind of forced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Zara, darling," she said when I answered. "I wanted to thank you for being so gracious last night. I know the evening was a bit formal for your tastes, but it was important for Ivy and Marcus's professional image. Even her gratitude felt like criticism." I could almost hear the unspoken message. Thank you for not embarrassing us. Thank you for knowing your place. Thank you for being appropriately invisible. Of course, Mom. I was happy to be there. Good, good. Listen, I was calling because we're having a small family dinner this Sunday. Just the immediate family, very casual. I thought it would be nice to reconnect after all the anniversary excitement. Something in her tone set off alarm bells. Mom had never been one for casual family dinners, especially not ones that included me without a specific occasion or obligation attached. That sounds lovely, I said carefully. Will Uncle Thomas be joining us? Oh, Thomas is so busy with his art projects these days. Besides, this is really more for the core family unit. You, me, your father, Ivy, and Marcus. A chance to discuss some exciting developments in the family business. The way she said family business made my skin crawl. I had a terrible suspicion that this dinner was somehow connected to my stolen inheritance, that they were planning to present me with some version of the truth that cast them as the heroes and me as the grateful beneficiary of their wise financial management. I'll be there, I said, my mind already racing with possibilities. Should I bring anything? Just yourself, darling. And Zara? Please don't mention this to Thomas or anyone else. We want to keep things private until we've had a chance to discuss everything as a family. After I hung up, Uncle Thomas was watching me with concern. That didn't sound like a casual family dinner. I don't think it was. I think they're planning to tell me some version of the vineyard story. Probably one where they're the heroes who saved me from the burden of managing property I couldn't handle. Thomas shook his head in disgust. The audacity is remarkable. They steal from you, then want credit for protecting you from your own inheritance. I spent the rest of the afternoon with Thomas, going through his files and documenting everything that might be relevant to Patricia Grayson's investigation. By the time I left his house, I had copies of property records, newspaper articles, and a timeline that suggested the inheritance thefts had been going on for over a year. That evening, I sat in my apartment and called Patricia. She listened to my update with professional calm, asking sharp questions about dates and details. When I finished describing Thomas's research and the pattern of elderly victims, she was quiet for a long moment. Miss Hendricks, she said finally, I think we're dealing with something much larger than a simple inheritance fraud. If your uncle's research is accurate, this could be a case of elder abuse and organized fraud that involves multiple victims and multiple properties. What does that mean for my case? It means we need to be very careful about how we proceed. And it means you might be in more danger than we initially realized. These people have a lot to lose if their scheme is exposed, and they've already demonstrated a willingness to commit serious crimes to protect their interests. The word danger made my stomach clench. I'd been thinking of this as a family dispute, albeit a serious one. But Patricia was talking about criminal conspiracy, about people who might be willing to go to extreme lengths to cover their tracks. What should I do about the family dinner on Sunday? Go, but be careful. Don't let them know you suspect anything, but pay attention to everything they say. Record the conversation if you can do it safely. We need to understand how much they know about our investigation and what their next move might be. After I hung up, I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the city lights scattered across the Portland hills. Somewhere out there, my sister was probably curled up with Marcus in their beautiful home, planning their next business venture or their next vacation, secure in the knowledge that they had successfully stolen my inheritance and gotten away with it. But they had underestimated Eleanor Whitmore's foresight and my own determination to fight for what was rightfully mine. They had also underestimated Uncle Thomas's loyalty and his talent for uncovering inconvenient truths. Sunday's dinner was going to be interesting. They thought they were summoning me to receive their version of events, to be grateful for their wise management of my affairs. Instead, they would be providing me with evidence for the criminal case that was already being built against them. I pulled out my laptop and started researching everything I could find about elder abuse laws in Oregon, about inheritance fraud, about the criminal penalties for forgery and conspiracy. If my family wanted to play this game, I was going to make sure I understood all the rules. The next few days passed in a blur of research and preparation. I met with Patricia twice more, once at her office, and once at a quiet coffee shop in Southeast Portland, where we could talk without being overheard. She had already begun the forensic analysis of the forged signatures, and had identified at least 2 other suspicious inheritance cases that fit the pattern Thomas had discovered. The scope of the investigation was expanding daily. Patricia had contacted the district attorney's office and the state attorney general's fraud division. She had also reached out to adult protective services regarding the potential elder abuse angle. What had started as my personal quest for justice was turning into a major criminal investigation. On Saturday morning, I went shopping for a dress to wear to Sunday's family dinner. I wanted something that would photograph well, since I planned to record the entire conversation. I also wanted to look successful and confident, not like someone who could be easily manipulated or dismissed. I chose a deep blue dress that brought out my eyes and a pair of heels that added 3 inches to my height. When I looked in the dressing room mirror, I saw someone who looked capable of fighting for herself. Someone who wouldn't be pushed around or made to feel grateful for scraps. That afternoon, I visited Eleanor Whitmore's grave for the first time. The cemetery was peaceful, filled with old-growth trees and weathered headstones that told the stories of Portland families going back generations. Eleanor's grave was marked with a simple granite stone that bore her name, dates, and a single line: "She saw clearly and loved deeply." I sat on the grass beside her grave and told her about everything that had happened since Patricia had found me at the anniversary party. I thanked her for her foresight, for protecting me even after her death, for seeing my worth when my own family couldn't or wouldn't. The wind rustled through the maple trees overhead, sending a few early autumn leaves drifting down around me. I chose to interpret it as Eleanor's way of letting me know she approved of the fight I was about to wage on her behalf. Sunday arrived crisp and clear, the kind of October day that made Portland look like a postcard. I dressed carefully, checked the recording app on my phone twice, and drove to my parents' house in Laurelhurst with my heart pounding and my resolve firmly in place. The house looked exactly the same as it had throughout my childhood, a Tudor-style mansion that projected old money and established respectability. The circular driveway was already occupied by Ivy's sleek BMW and Marcus's Mercedes, their vehicles gleaming in the afternoon sunlight like symbols of their success. I parked my modest Honda behind Marcus's car and took a deep breath. Whatever they were planning to tell me tonight, I was ready. I had Eleanor's letter in my purse, Patricia's business card in my wallet, and a recording device that would capture every word they said. It was time to let them hang themselves with their own lies. Mom answered the door, wearing her favorite hostess smile and a cream-colored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She kissed my cheek with the kind of careful affection that wouldn't disturb her lipstick, then stepped back to appraise my appearance with those sharp eyes that never missed a detail. "You look lovely, darling," she said, though her tone suggested she was surprised by this development. "That color is quite flattering on you. Come in, everyone's already gathered in the living room." The house smelled like expensive candles and the roast beef that had been our traditional Sunday dinner throughout my childhood. Everything looked exactly as I remembered, from the oriental rugs to the crystal vases filled with fresh flowers. But now I noticed details that had escaped my attention before, like the way every family photo displayed prominently featured only 3 people. The few pictures that included me were relegated to side tables or tucked into corners where they wouldn't dominate the narrative. Dad rose from his leather armchair when I entered the living room, his movements careful and deliberate. He'd always been a man who considered his gestures, who understood that everything he did sent a message about his status and intentions. Today he seemed more formal than usual, like someone preparing for a business negotiation, rather than a family dinner. "Zara," he said, extending his hand for a handshake rather than attempting a hug. "Punctual as always. I appreciate that in a person." Ivy was curled up on the sofa beside Marcus, both of them holding wine glasses and looking relaxed in that particular way that suggested they'd already had several conversations I hadn't been privy to. They were dressed casually but expensively, the kind of effortless wealth that came from never having to think about money or worry about making the right impression. Marcus stood when he saw me, his lawyer's training evident in the smooth way he transitioned from relaxed socializing to polite attention. He was wearing khakis and a button-down shirt that probably cost more than my entire outfit, but he carried himself like someone wearing a perfectly tailored suit. "Zara, great to see you again so soon," he said, his handshake firm and professional. "How are you settling back into the routine after all the anniversary excitement?" The question felt loaded somehow, like he was fishing for information about my state of mind or my plans. I smiled and gave him a non-committal response about being glad to celebrate such a meaningful milestone, then accepted the glass of wine Mom pressed into my hands. The conversation during cocktails was carefully orchestrated, touching on safe topics like the weather, local restaurant recommendations, and Ivy's latest interior design projects. But I could feel an undercurrent of tension, like everyone was waiting for something to happen or someone to make the first move. Mom announced dinner with the kind of gracious efficiency that had made her a successful hostess for 3 decades. The dining room table was set with her best china and silver, the kind of formal presentation usually reserved for important guests or special occasions. I found myself wondering what exactly they thought they were celebrating. As we settled into our seats, Dad cleared his throat in the particular way that meant he was about to deliver a speech. This had been his trademark move throughout my childhood, the moment when casual family time transformed into something more structured and purposeful. "Before we begin eating," he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used for board meetings and client presentations, "there's something important we need to discuss as a family. Something that affects all of us, but particularly you, Zara." I felt my pulse quicken but kept my expression neutral, the way Patricia had coached me. Whatever they were about to tell me, I needed to let them reveal their hand completely before showing any reaction. "As you know," Ivy continued, taking over the narrative with the smooth teamwork they'd perfected over years of managing family dynamics, "we've been working very hard to expand our business interests and create long-term financial security for the family." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression serious and concerned. "Over the past year, we've had several opportunities to invest in properties that could provide significant returns for all of us. But some of these opportunities required immediate action and substantial capital investments." Dad nodded approvingly, like a professor encouraging a promising student. "The challenge with investment opportunities is that they don't wait for convenient timing. When a valuable property becomes available, you have to move quickly or lose the chance entirely." I sipped my wine and waited for them to get to the point, though I was beginning to understand the shape of the story they were constructing. They were building a narrative where their theft of my inheritance would be reframed as wise financial management on my behalf. Mom served the salad with her usual attention to presentation, arranging the greens and cherry tomatoes like she was creating a work of art. "The thing is, darling," she said without looking up from her plating, "when Eleanor Whitmore passed away, she left you that vineyard property in the Willamette Valley. It was a lovely gesture, but not exactly practical for someone in your situation." The casual way she delivered this information, like she was commenting on the weather, made my stomach clench with anger. They were admitting to the inheritance theft, while simultaneously dismissing both Eleanor's intentions and my ability to handle my own affairs. Ivy picked up the thread with practiced ease. "We knew you'd never been interested in agriculture or property management, and frankly, a vineyard is an enormous responsibility. The insurance costs alone would have been overwhelming for someone with your current income level." Marcus nodded sagely, every inch the concerned family attorney looking out for his naive sister-in-law's best interests. "Vineyard properties require constant maintenance, specialized knowledge, and significant ongoing investment. Without proper management, they can become financial sinkholes rather than assets." "So Dad said," his tone suggesting he was delivering good news rather than confessing to a crime, "we made the difficult decision to handle the inheritance transfer on your behalf. We used our expertise and connections to ensure the property was managed properly, and that you would benefit from the investment without being burdened by the day-to-day responsibilities." The audacity of their presentation was breathtaking. They had stolen my inheritance, forged my signature, and used my money to buy property they planned to use against Uncle Thomas, and they were presenting it as a favor they'd done for me. I set down my wine glass and looked around the table at their expectant faces. They were waiting for me to express gratitude, to thank them for their wise stewardship of an inheritance I supposedly couldn't handle. The recording app on my phone was capturing every word of their confession. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said carefully. "I appreciate you looking out for my interests. But I'm curious about the details. How exactly did you handle the transfer? Did Eleanor's lawyer contact me directly about the inheritance?" Mom and Dad exchanged a quick glance, the kind of wordless communication that longtime couples develop. There was a pause just long enough to suggest they were deciding how much truth to include in their version of events. The legal process was quite complex, Marcus said, his lawyer's training evident in the way he chose his words. Eleanor's estate planning had some irregularities that required careful navigation. We worked with her attorney to ensure everything was handled properly and that all the necessary paperwork was completed correctly. Ivy leaned forward with what looked like genuine concern. We didn't want to burden you with all the legal complications while you were grieving Eleanor's loss. She was such a special woman, and we knew how much her death affected you. The mention of my grief felt like a slap in the face. They had used my emotional state as cover for their crime, had counted on my sadness to prevent me from asking questions or paying attention to legal documents that should have come directly to me. Dad served the roast beef with the kind of precise, methodical movements that suggested he was buying time to organize his thoughts. The important thing to understand, Zara, is that the vineyard property has already generated substantial returns on investment. We've been able to leverage it as collateral for additional property acquisitions that will benefit the entire family. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the confession that linked my stolen inheritance to their other business dealings. I thought about Uncle Thomas's research, about the pattern of elder abuse that Patricia was investigating, about all the elderly women who had trusted my family and been betrayed. That sounds very profitable, I said, keeping my voice steady. What other properties have you been able to acquire? I'd love to understand how my inheritance has been growing. Marcus smiled with what looked like genuine pride in his financial acumen. We've been particularly successful in the residential development sector. There's a property adjacent to your Uncle Thomas's house that represents exactly the kind of strategic investment opportunity we're talking about. The casual way he mentioned pressuring my uncle out of his home, using my own stolen money to do it, made me feel physically sick. But I forced myself to nod encouragingly, to play the role of the impressed younger sister who was grateful for their business expertise. Ivy reached across the table and patted my hand with sisterly affection. The best part is that you don't have to worry about any of the complicated legal or financial aspects. We'll continue to manage everything on your behalf, and you'll receive quarterly statements showing how your investment is performing. So I don't actually own the vineyard anymore? I asked, making my voice sound confused rather than accusatory. It's been transferred to your company? Dad nodded approvingly, like I was finally beginning to understand the sophisticated financial arrangement they'd created. Exactly. Evergreen Holdings now manages the property, along with several other strategic investments. It's much more efficient from a tax and liability perspective, and it allows us to maximize the return on investment through diversified holdings. Mom began clearing the salad plates with the kind of smooth efficiency that suggested this conversation was going exactly as they'd planned. The wonderful thing about family businesses is that everyone benefits from the collective success. Your inheritance is working much harder now than it ever could have if it had remained as a single property in your name. Throughout the rest of dinner, they continued to elaborate on their vision of family financial cooperation, painting a picture of shared prosperity and wise management that made their theft sound like philanthropy. They talked about trust funds and investment strategies, about long-term planning and generational wealth building, all while serving my grandmother's china and pouring wine that probably cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. Marcus pulled out his phone during dessert and showed me a presentation he'd apparently prepared for this occasion. The slides showed property values, projected returns, and cash flow analyses that made their scheme look like a sophisticated investment portfolio rather than organized fraud. As you can see, he said, scrolling through charts and graphs with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed his own marketing materials, the diversified approach has generated returns that far exceed what a single vineyard property could have produced. Ivy nodded enthusiastically, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement that came from successfully solving a complex problem. And the best part is that you don't have to do anything except enjoy the benefits. We handle all the management responsibilities, all the decision-making, all the regulatory compliance issues. The phrase regulatory compliance made me wonder if they'd considered the legal implications of forgery and inheritance fraud, or if they'd simply assumed they were too smart and well-connected to face consequences for their actions. As the evening wound down, Mom presented me with a leather portfolio containing what she described as my quarterly investment statements and projections for future growth. The documents looked professional and impressive, full of financial terminology and official-looking charts that disguised the fact that they were essentially confessing to stealing my inheritance in writing. Dad walked me to the door with the kind of paternal warmth that had been missing from our relationship for years. "I hope this evening has helped you understand how much we care about your financial security, Zara. Family, looking out for family, that's what it's all about." I hugged each of them goodbye, the same ritual embraces that had ended thousands of family gatherings throughout my childhood. But this time I was memorizing their faces, studying their expressions, noting the casual confidence that came from believing they'd successfully manipulated someone they considered naive and trusting. Ivy was the last to say goodbye, holding my hands in hers with what looked like genuine sisterly affection. "I'm so glad we could finally discuss all of this openly. I was worried you might feel left out of the family business decisions, but now you can see how much thought and care we've put into protecting your interests." The word protecting felt like a knife twist, but I managed to smile and thank her for everything they'd done on my behalf. As I drove away from the house, I could see them through the living room windows, probably congratulating themselves on successfully managing a potentially difficult family conversation. But what they didn't know was that they had just provided me with hours of recorded confessions, detailed financial documents, and enough evidence to support both civil and criminal charges. They had been so confident in their ability to control the narrative that they'd essentially testified against themselves. I drove straight to a 24-hour copy center and made multiple copies of everything they'd given me, then secured the originals in a safety deposit box I'd opened specifically for this purpose. The recording of the dinner conversation was automatically backed up to cloud storage, where it would be preserved even if something happened to my phone. Patricia Grayson was going to be very interested in what my family had revealed during their attempt to make me complicit in my own victimization. They had stolen my inheritance, used it to harm my uncle, and then invited me to dinner to thank them for their criminal enterprise. But their biggest mistake had been underestimating my ability to see through their carefully constructed lies. They had treated me like a child who could be pacified with sophisticated presentations and family loyalty rhetoric, never considering that I might be smart enough to recognize theft when it was gift-wrapped and served with wine. Tomorrow I would deliver everything to Patricia, and let the legal system begin the process of holding them accountable for their crimes. Tonight I sat in my apartment and marveled at the elaborate performance they'd staged, the months of planning that had gone into creating a narrative where their theft became my benefit. Eleanor Whitmore had been right to worry about my family's intentions. She had seen clearly the people they really were beneath their polished surfaces and social respectability. Now it was time to honor her memory by ensuring that justice was served, and that her final gift to me wouldn't be stolen by people who mistook kindness for weakness. The rain started again as I prepared for bed, Portland's familiar rhythm against my windows. But for the first time in weeks, the sound felt comforting rather than melancholy. Tomorrow would bring consequences that my family had never imagined, revelations that would shatter their carefully constructed world of privilege and presumption. They had invited me to dinner thinking they were securing my silence and complicity. Instead, they had provided me with everything I needed to destroy them. Patricia Grayson's office building gleamed in the early morning light as I stepped out of the elevator on the 14th floor, carrying a briefcase that contained enough evidence to destroy my family's carefully constructed empire. The recording from Sunday's dinner, combined with the financial documents they'd provided, had given us everything needed to move forward with both civil and criminal proceedings. Patricia's assistant led me into the conference room where Patricia was already waiting with two other people I hadn't met before. She introduced them as Detective Sarah Chen from the Portland Police Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit and Assistant District Attorney Michael Torres, who specialized in elder abuse cases. "Miss Hendricks," Patricia said, her expression serious but satisfied, "what your family provided at that dinner has exceeded our most optimistic expectations for evidence gathering. They essentially confessed to multiple felonies while documenting their criminal enterprise in writing." Detective Chen was a woman in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and the kind of steady presence that suggested she'd seen every type of fraud imaginable. She pulled out a digital recorder and set it on the conference table between us. We'd like you to walk us through the entire evening, from the moment you arrived at your parents' house until you left. Take your time and include every detail you can remember. For the next 2 hours, I recounted every conversation, every gesture, every telling pause in my family's carefully orchestrated performance. Detective Chen asked sharp questions about specific phrases they'd used, about the financial documents they'd provided, about their body language when discussing the forged signatures. Ada Torres took detailed notes while I spoke, occasionally interrupting to clarify legal terminology or ask about my understanding of their statements. When I finished describing the evening, he leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone who'd just been handed an early Christmas present. "What we have here," he said, "is conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, forgery, identity theft, and possibly money laundering." The recording alone would be sufficient for prosecution, but combined with the forensic evidence and the pattern of similar crimes, this case is exceptionally strong. Patricia pulled out a timeline she'd been developing that showed the progression of their criminal activities over the past 18 months. According to her research, my inheritance had been the largest single theft, but it was part of a systematic pattern of targeting elderly women who trusted the Hendricks family's reputation for financial expertise. The most damaging evidence, Detective Chen explained, was their own documentation of how they'd used my stolen inheritance as collateral for additional property acquisitions. The paper trail clearly showed that Eleanor Whitmore's vineyard had been fraudulently transferred to Evergreen Holdings, then immediately leveraged to secure loans for other investments. "What happens next?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I was ready for the answer. Ada Torres exchanged glances with Detective Chen before responding. "We'll be seeking warrants for the arrest of Marcus Coleman, Ivy Hendricks Coleman, Victoria Hendricks, and Grant Hendricks on multiple felony charges. We'll also be freezing the assets of Evergreen Holdings and Hendricks & Associates pending the outcome of the investigation." The reality of what was about to happen hit me like a physical blow. In a matter of days, my entire family would be facing criminal charges that could result in significant prison time. Their businesses would be shut down, their assets frozen, their reputations destroyed. Everything they'd worked to build would be gone. Patricia must have seen my expression because she reached across the table and touched my arm gently. "I know this feels overwhelming, but you need to remember that you didn't create this situation. They chose to commit these crimes, and they chose to target you specifically because they thought you wouldn't fight back." Detective Chen nodded in agreement. "In my experience, people who commit these types of fraud schemes always underestimate their victims. They assume that family loyalty or emotional manipulation will prevent people from seeking justice. Your willingness to stand up for yourself probably prevented them from victimizing additional elderly victims." The investigation moved forward with startling speed. Within 48 hours, search warrants had been executed at both my parents' house and Marcus and Ivy's home. Detective Chen called me that evening to report that they'd recovered computers, financial records, and correspondence that corroborated everything we'd suspected about the scope of their criminal enterprise. The local news picked up the story 2 days later, initially as a brief item about fraud charges against a prominent Portland family. But as more details emerged about the pattern of elder abuse and the sophisticated nature of the scheme, it became front-page news. The headlines were devastating. "Prominent family charged in elder fraud scheme. Real estate dynasty built on stolen inheritances. Trust betrayed. How respected Portland family preyed on elderly friends." I watched the coverage from my apartment, feeling surreal as news anchors discussed my family's crimes with the kind of clinical detachment reserved for strangers. But these weren't strangers. These were the people who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bicycle and helped with homework and attended school plays. The cognitive dissonance between those memories and the reality of their criminal behavior was almost unbearable. My phone began ringing constantly as reporters tried to reach me for comment. I'd prepared for this possibility with Patricia's help, and we'd agreed that I would refer all media inquiries to her office. But the persistent buzzing became so intrusive that I finally turned off my phone and tried to find some peace in the silence. The arraignment was scheduled for the following Monday. Patricia explained that I wouldn't be required to attend, but I wanted to be there to see justice beginning to unfold. I arrived at the courthouse early and found a seat in the gallery where I could observe without being easily noticed by my family or their attorneys. When they brought my parents into the courtroom, I was shocked by how diminished they looked. Dad's usual commanding presence had evaporated, replaced by the hunched shoulders and vacant stare of someone whose world had collapsed overnight. Mom looked smaller somehow, her designer clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to have shrunk with the weight of public humiliation. Ivy and Marcus entered together, flanked by their respective attorneys. Even facing criminal charges, they maintained some of their polished appearance, but there was a brittle quality to their composure that suggested they were barely holding themselves together. Ivy's eyes darted around the courtroom as if looking for an escape route, while Marcus stared straight ahead with the grim focus of someone enduring a medical procedure. The judge read the charges with methodical precision: conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse in the first degree, identity theft, forgery, money laundering. Each count carried potential prison sentences that, when combined, could result in decades behind bars. The prosecutor requested high bail amounts, citing the defendants' access to hidden assets and their history of sophisticated financial crimes. When the judge announced the bail amounts, I heard Mom gasp audibly from across the courtroom. Even with their considerable wealth, posting bail for all 4 defendants would require liquidating significant assets. The irony wasn't lost on me that they would need to sell legitimate properties to pay for their freedom while awaiting trial for stealing illegitimate ones. After the arraignment, I met Patricia at a coffee shop several blocks from the courthouse. She looked satisfied but cautious, the expression of someone who'd won an important battle but knew the war wasn't over. "How do you feel?" she asked, studying my face carefully. I wasn't sure how to answer. Part of me felt vindicated, finally seeing consequences for the years of emotional manipulation and systematic exclusion I'd endured. But another part felt profound sadness for the family relationships that were now irreparably broken, for the future gatherings that would never happen, for the possibility of reconciliation that had died with their arrests. "Hello," I said finally, like something important has ended, but I'm not sure what comes next. Patricia nodded with understanding. "That's normal in cases like this. You've been fighting for justice for months, and now that you've achieved it, there's bound to be an emotional letdown. The important thing to remember is that you did the right thing, both for yourself and for the other victims they might have targeted." Over the next several weeks, additional details about my family's crimes emerged through court filings and plea negotiations. The scope of their fraud was even larger than we'd initially suspected, involving not just inheritance theft, but also investment fraud targeting clients of Dad's real estate company. They had used their reputation and social connections to gain access to elderly investors, then systematically looted their accounts through fabricated investment opportunities. Uncle Thomas called me regularly during this period, offering support and sharing his own feelings about watching his brother face criminal prosecution. He'd known Grant was capable of questionable business practices, but the systematic nature of the elder abuse had shocked even his cynical worldview. The hardest part, he told me during one of our evening phone calls, is realizing how many people they hurt. These weren't strangers they targeted. These were family friends, people who trusted them because of relationships that went back decades. I found myself thinking about Eleanor Whitmore often during those weeks, wondering if she'd anticipated the full scope of what her final gift would set in motion. Her vineyard inheritance hadn't just provided me with financial security. It had exposed a criminal enterprise that might have continued indefinitely if she hadn't taken steps to protect me. The civil proceedings moved forward parallel to the criminal case. Patricia filed lawsuits seeking the return of all stolen assets, plus damages for the emotional distress and financial losses their fraud had caused. The vineyard property was restored to my ownership within a month, along with the proceeds from its illegal use as collateral for other investments. Marcus and Ivy's anniversary celebration, which had seemed so perfect just weeks earlier, now felt like a grotesque farce. They had toasted their marriage and their success, while standing on a foundation of stolen money and forged documents. Every smile in those photographs, every congratulatory handshake, every moment of apparent happiness had been built on lies. The plea negotiations began in earnest as winter settled over Portland, Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of lengthy prison sentences, 3 of the 4 defendants indicated willingness to accept responsibility for their crimes in exchange for reduced penalties. Only Marcus continued to maintain his innocence, apparently believing his legal training and professional connections would somehow extricate him from consequences. His stubbornness proved costly when additional evidence emerged during discovery that showed he'd been the primary architect of the fraud scheme. Financial records revealed that he'd used his legal expertise to design sophisticated methods for stealing inheritances, while minimizing the risk of detection. Email communications showed him coaching other family members on how to forge signatures and manipulate elderly victims. Patricia showed me some of these emails during one of our regular meetings, and reading them made me feel physically sick. Marcus had written detailed instructions about identifying vulnerable targets, about exploiting their trust and family connections, about timing their thefts to coincide with periods of grief or medical crisis, when victims would be least likely to pay attention to legal documents. One email in particular haunted me. It was dated just 3 days after Eleanor Whitmore's funeral, and it discussed me specifically as a target for inheritance fraud. Marcus had written that I was emotionally vulnerable and financially naive, making me an ideal victim for what he called proactive estate management. He'd estimated that they could steal my inheritance and manipulate me into gratitude within 6 months. The casual way he'd discussed destroying my life, the clinical terminology he'd used to describe emotional manipulation, revealed a level of callousness that was almost incomprehensible. This wasn't just theft. It was a calculated assault on my dignity and autonomy by someone who was supposed to protect my interests as family. When the plea agreements were finalized in early December, the sentences reflected the severity and sophistication of their crimes. Dad received 5 years in federal prison, plus restitution payments that would likely consume most of his remaining assets. Mom got 3 years plus community service and probation. Ivy received 2 years in minimum security prison, followed by extensive probation and mandatory counseling. Marcus, who had refused to plea bargain and insisted on going to trial, was ultimately convicted on all counts and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. His law license was permanently revoked, and he was ordered to pay damages that exceeded anything he could realistically afford. The career he'd spent decades building was completely destroyed. The civil settlements restored not just my inheritance, but also compensation for the emotional damage their fraud had caused. More importantly, the publicity surrounding their convictions had prompted other elderly victims to come forward, leading to additional criminal charges and civil recoveries that provided some measure of justice for people who had trusted my family and been betrayed. As winter deepened into spring, I began the process of deciding what to do with the vineyard property that had started this entire saga. Eleanor's letter had emphasized her hope that I would love the land for what it truly was, not just for its financial value. So I drove out to the Willamette Valley on a clear April morning to see my inheritance for the first time. The vineyard was more beautiful than I'd imagined. Rolling hills covered with neat rows of grapevines just beginning to show their spring growth. The farmhouse was small but charming, with wide porches and windows that framed views of the surrounding countryside. I could picture Eleanor here, tending to her roses and watching the seasons change with the rhythms of agricultural life. I spent the afternoon walking through the vineyard, thinking about legacy and justice, about the difference between inheritance and theft. Eleanor had wanted me to have this place because she'd believed I would appreciate it for more than its monetary value. She'd been right about my family's intentions, but she'd also been right about my character. Standing among the grapevines that afternoon, I made a decision that would have pleased Eleanor and horrified my family. I would keep the vineyard, but I would also transform it into something that honored her memory while serving others who had been victimized by fraud and abuse. The Whitmore Center for Elder Justice opened 18 months later, operating from the renovated farmhouse and offering legal assistance, counseling services, and advocacy support for elderly people who had been targeted by financial predators. The vineyard continued to operate commercially, but its profits now funded services for vulnerable populations rather than luxury lifestyles for criminals. On the day of the center's grand opening, Uncle Thomas stood beside me as we cut the ribbon that officially launched our new mission. Patricia Grayson was there, along with Detective Chen and several of the other elderly victims whose cases had been resolved through our investigation. But the person I thought about most was Eleanor Whitmore, whose final gift had made all of this possible. My family had tried to steal my inheritance and erase my place in their story. Instead, they had given me the opportunity to write my own story, one based on justice rather than theft, on service rather than selfishness. They had underestimated my strength, my intelligence, and my determination to fight for what was right. The vineyard Eleanor left me was worth far more than the money they'd tried to steal. It was worth my dignity, my independence, and my ability to help others who had been victimized by people they trusted. In trying to rob me of my inheritance, my family had inadvertently given me something much more valuable: the knowledge that I was strong enough to stand up for myself and others, no matter the cost. 3 years after the convictions, I woke up in the farmhouse on Eleanor's vineyard, to the sound of birds greeting the dawn, and the gentle hum of sprinkler systems watering the vines. The morning light filtered through lace curtains that I'd found in Eleanor's hope chest, along with handwritten notes about which windows they belonged to and why she'd chosen each pattern. Even in death, she was still taking care of me. The Whitmore Center for Elder Justice had grown beyond anything I'd imagined when I first conceived it. What started as a small legal aid office in the renovated farmhouse had expanded to include a victim advocacy program, financial literacy workshops, and a network of volunteer attorneys who provided pro bono services to elderly clients throughout the Pacific Northwest. We'd helped recover over $2 million in stolen assets and prevented countless additional frauds through our education and awareness programs. This morning was special because we were hosting our annual Eleanor Whitmore Memorial Conference, bringing together legal professionals, social workers, and law enforcement officers from across the region to share best practices for combating elder financial abuse. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's crimes had created the blueprint for protecting other families from similar victimization. I dressed carefully in a navy blue dress that Eleanor would have approved of. Practical but elegant, suitable for someone who had work to do in the world. The woman looking back at me from the mirror bore little resemblance to the uncertain person who had sat alone at table 12 during that anniversary celebration. My confidence came not from external validation, but from the knowledge that I was living a life of purpose and integrity. The kitchen smelled like the coffee cake I'd baked the night before using Eleanor's recipe, which I'd found written in her careful handwriting on an index card tucked inside her favorite cookbook. These small domestic rituals had become important to me, ways of honoring her memory while creating new traditions that reflected my own values and choices. As I set up the conference room that had once been Eleanor's living room, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me here. My family's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also freed me from a lifetime of seeking approval from people who were incapable of giving it. In trying to erase me from their story, they had inadvertently given me the space to write my own. The first conference attendees began arriving at 8 o'clock, parking their cars along the gravel driveway that wound between the vineyard rows. I recognized many faces from previous years, but there were also newcomers who had heard about our work through professional networks or media coverage. Each person represented another community where vulnerable elderly residents would be better protected because of the knowledge they gained here. Dr. Margaret Foster from Portland State University's gerontology program was the keynote speaker, presenting research on the psychological factors that made elderly people susceptible to financial fraud. Her work had been informed partly by interviews with victims who had come forward after my family's crimes were exposed, creating a body of knowledge that could help identify and prevent similar schemes. During the lunch break, I walked through the vineyard with Patricia Grayson, who had become not just my attorney but also a close friend and advisor. She came to every conference, sharing her expertise about the legal remedies available to fraud victims and the challenges of prosecuting family-based financial crimes. Patricia pointed to a section of vines that were producing particularly well this season, their clusters heavy with grapes that would be harvested in a few weeks. "It's remarkable what this place has become," she said. "Eleanor would be so proud of what you've built here." "I hope so," I replied, touching one of the grape clusters gently. "Sometimes I feel like I'm still learning who I am without them, without the constant effort to earn acceptance from people who were never going to give it." Patricia nodded with understanding. "That's one of the hardest parts of family estrangement, even when it's necessary. You have to rebuild your identity from scratch, figure out what you actually want versus what you thought you were supposed to want." We walked in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of conference attendees networking on the farmhouse porch and the distant hum of vineyard equipment. The land itself had become a source of peace for me, its seasonal rhythms providing stability that human relationships had failed to offer. The afternoon sessions focused on practical interventions, with workshops on recognizing warning signs of financial abuse, developing community response protocols, and supporting victims through the legal process. I facilitated a panel discussion with 3 elderly survivors who shared their experiences of being targeted by family members and the long journey toward healing and justice. One of the panelists, Mrs. Dorothy Chen, was 83 years old and had lost nearly her entire retirement savings to a grandson who had convinced her to invest in fraudulent real estate schemes. Her story was heartbreakingly similar to what my family had done to Eleanor's friends, the systematic exploitation of trust and affection for financial gain. The hardest part, Mrs. Chen said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her words, was accepting that someone I loved could see me as nothing more than a source of money. I kept making excuses for him, kept believing his promises to pay me back, because I couldn't imagine that my own grandson would deliberately hurt me. Her words resonated through the conference room, acknowledging a truth that many of the professionals present dealt with regularly, but that society was often reluctant to confront. Family relationships could be sources of profound harm as well as love, and the people most trusted often had the greatest opportunity to inflict damage. Another panelist, Mr. James Morrison, had been victimized by his daughter-in-law in a scheme remarkably similar to what Marcus and Ivy had done to me. She had convinced him to sign over power of attorney while he was recovering from surgery, then systematically drained his accounts while he was too weak to monitor his finances. What saved me, he said, was my neighbor who noticed that I wasn't getting my usual mail and called Adult Protective Services. Sometimes it takes an outsider to see what family members are missing or choosing to ignore. As the conference wound down in the late afternoon, I stood on the farmhouse porch watching attendees exchange business cards and make plans for continued collaboration. The network of professionals we'd brought together represented thousands of elderly people who would be better protected because of the knowledge and connections formed here today. Uncle Thomas arrived just as the last conference attendees were leaving, carrying a bouquet of sunflowers from his garden and wearing the kind of paint-stained clothes that suggested he'd been working on a new piece. He'd become a regular visitor to the vineyard, finding peace in the landscape and purpose in helping with our educational programs. His relationship with my parents had never recovered from their crimes, though he'd visited Dad in prison a few times before finally accepting that his brother had chosen a path that made reconciliation impossible. The pain of that realization had found its way into his artwork, creating pieces that explored themes of betrayal, forgiveness, and the complexity of family loyalty. "How did the conference go?" he asked, settling into one of the rocking chairs on the porch that Eleanor had loved. "Really well," I said, taking the chair beside him. "We had over 100 attendees, and the feedback has been incredibly positive. More importantly, several people mentioned specific cases they're working on, where today's information will make a real difference." Thomas nodded approvingly, his artist's eye taking in the way the evening light played across the vineyard rows. Eleanor would have loved seeing all those people here, working together to protect others. She always said this place had good energy for bringing out the best in people. I thought about Eleanor often during these quiet evening moments on the porch, imagining her approval of what the vineyard had become. She'd left me property, but more importantly, she'd left me an example of how to see clearly and love deeply, how to protect the vulnerable while holding the powerful accountable. As twilight settled over the valley, Thomas and I talked about his latest painting series, which explored the idea of home as something you create rather than inherit. His work had evolved considerably since the family crisis, becoming more complex and emotionally nuanced as he processed his own feelings about loyalty, betrayal, and the courage required to tell difficult truths. The opening reception for his new show was scheduled for the following weekend at a gallery in Portland's Pearl District, not far from the apartment where I'd lived during the darkest period of discovering my family's crimes. I'd planned to attend, partly to support his work but also as a way of measuring how much I'd changed since those early days of shock and uncertainty. My parents had been released from prison 6 months earlier, though their lives bore little resemblance to their former prosperity and social standing. Dad worked at a hardware store in a small town outside Portland, his real estate empire reduced to helping customers select lawnmower parts and paint colors. Mom had taken a job at a nonprofit organization serving homeless families, perhaps finding some measure of redemption in helping people less fortunate than herself. Neither had attempted to contact me directly, though I occasionally heard updates through mutual acquaintances or Uncle Thomas. They seemed to be living quietly, perhaps finally understanding that their actions had consequences that extended far beyond legal penalties. Their social circle had evaporated, along with their wealth and reputation, leaving them to rebuild relationships based on who they actually were rather than what they could provide. Ivy had been released a year earlier and had moved to Seattle, where she was working as a clerk in an interior design firm, while slowly rebuilding her professional credentials. The irony of her reduced circumstances wasn't lost on me. She was now experiencing the kind of financial uncertainty and career limitations she'd once dismissed as character flaws in others. Marcus had the longest sentence and wouldn't be eligible for release for another 3 years. His fall had been the most dramatic. From senior partner at a prestigious law firm to federal inmate with no prospect of ever practicing law again. Uncle Thomas had mentioned that Ivy was seeking a divorce, finally acknowledging that their marriage had been built on shared criminality rather than genuine love or compatibility. Sometimes I wondered if any of them truly understood the scope of damage they'd caused, not just to their direct victims, but to the broader community trust that their crimes had violated. Elder abuse was particularly insidious because it exploited the fundamental human need for family connection and security, leaving victims not just financially devastated, but emotionally shattered. The work we did at the Whitmore Center addressed both aspects of this harm, providing practical assistance with legal and financial recovery, while also offering counseling and support groups for the emotional healing that was often more challenging than recouping stolen money. Many of our clients struggled with shame and self-blame, wondering how they could have been so naive as to trust family members who betrayed them. As full darkness settled over the vineyard, Thomas and I moved inside to the kitchen, where I prepared a simple dinner while he told me about his latest commission from a collector in San Francisco. His reputation had grown considerably since the family scandal, perhaps because his personal experience with betrayal and redemption had added depth and authenticity to his artistic vision. We ate by candlelight at the kitchen table, where Eleanor had probably shared thousands of meals, the domestic simplicity feeling like a luxury after years of formal family dinners, designed more for appearance than genuine connection. The conversation meandered through topics both serious and mundane, the kind of easy intimacy that comes from shared experience and mutual respect. After Thomas left, I walked through the quiet house, turning off lights and checking locks with the kind of peaceful routine that had replaced the anxiety and hypervigilance of my earlier years. The farmhouse felt secure in ways that had nothing to do with physical safety, and everything to do with being in a place where I belonged completely and unconditionally. My bedroom overlooked the vineyard, and I often fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the grape leaves, a natural lullaby that connected me to the rhythms of agricultural life that had sustained this land for generations. Eleanor's presence was strongest here, in the handmade quilt that covered my bed and the family photographs that showed her throughout different decades of loving this place. Before sleep, I read from the journal I'd been keeping since moving to the vineyard, documenting both the practical aspects of running the center and the more personal process of healing from family trauma. Writing had become a way of processing experiences that were too complex for simple conversation, of finding meaning in events that had initially seemed only destructive. Tonight's entry focused on the conference and the renewed sense of purpose it had given me. Each person who attended represented ripple effects that would extend far beyond our single day together. Protection and healing that would spread through communities in ways we might never fully know or quantify. The final paragraph addressed Eleanor directly, as I often did when writing felt like prayer. Thank you for seeing who I could become when I couldn't see it myself. Thank you for believing I was worth protecting and empowering. Thank you for teaching me that legacy isn't about what we inherit, but what we choose to do with the gifts we're given. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, victims who needed assistance and professionals who needed training, grapes that required harvesting and programs that needed funding. But tonight I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from living in alignment with your values, from building something meaningful, from the wreckage of betrayal and loss. My family had tried to write me out of their story, to erase my presence and steal my future. Instead, they had freed me to write my own story, one based on service rather than selfishness, on justice rather than exploitation, on love that protected rather than consumed. The girl who had sat alone at table 12, wearing her guest badge and wondering why she didn't belong, had discovered that belonging isn't something you earn from others. It's something you create for yourself by living with integrity and purpose, by using your gifts to serve something larger than your own comfort and security. Eleanor Whitmore had left me more than a vineyard. She had left me an example of how to see clearly and love deeply, how to protect the vulnerable while holding the powerful accountable. In honoring her legacy, I had discovered my own strength and created a life that reflected my values rather than my family's expectations. As sleep finally came, I felt gratitude not just for what I had gained, but for what I had lost. Being rejected by people who valued appearances over authenticity had forced me to develop relationships based on genuine connection rather than obligation. Losing my place in their story had given me the freedom to write my own. The last thing I saw before closing my eyes was moonlight streaming through the vineyard, illuminating the rows of vines that would soon produce another harvest. Each season brought new growth from old roots, new abundance from patient cultivation, new hope from the eternal cycle of death and renewal. My family's betrayal had planted seeds they never intended, growing into justice they never expected, creating beauty they would never fully understand. That was legacy enough for me. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.